The red earth of Burkina Faso stretched endlessly beneath the scorching Sahel sun, its ancient dust swirling in the harmattan winds that carried whispers of ancestors and promises of storms to come. In the presidential palace of Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before the towering windows, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, watching the baobab trees sway like old griots telling stories of resistance. "Monsieur le Président," his aide whispered, entering the room with careful steps. "The American ambassador has arrived." Traoré's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady as the morning call to prayer. "Let him wait. Our ancestors waited 400 years for freedom. He can wait 10 minutes. The aide's eyes flickered with understanding. This was not merely diplomatic protocol. This was the measured breath before the lion's roar. Outside, the streets of Ouagadougou pulsed with the rhythm of motorcycles, vendors calling out and more, and the endless dance of survival that had characterized this land since time immemorial. Children played football with balls made of plastic bags and tape, their laughter rising above the dust like prayers to Niam, the sky god. Traoré closed his eyes and let the sounds wash over him. In them, he heard his grandmother's voice, Naba Yanenga, she used to call him when he was small, after the legendary warrior princess who founded the Mossi kingdoms. "A true leader," she would say, stirring the two with movements older than memory, "must never forget that power is not a gift from the white man's god or the white man's government. Power flows from the earth, from the people, from the blood of those who died so their children might stand tall." Now, at 34, wearing the weight of a nation's hopes like a Kent cloth across his shoulders, those words burned in his chest like ceremonial fire. The door opened again, and this time Ambassador Richardson strode in, tall, pale, sweating despite the air conditioning, his blue suit wrinkled from the heat and his barely concealed irritation. Behind him walked two men in dark glasses, their movements too precise, too aware, marking them as more than mere diplomats. "Captain Traoré," Richardson began, his French accented with the arrogance of assumed superiority, "I trust you understand the gravity of the situation." Traoré turned slowly, his brown eyes holding the steady gaze of a man who had stared down coup attempts and slept under stars during military campaigns. When he spoke, his voice carried the measured cadence of traditional storytellers, each word weighted with ancestral authority. "Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, in my language we have a saying, the dog that barks loudest is often the most afraid. Please sit. We have much to discuss." Richardson's face flushed red as the laterite soil. "Captain, let me be clear. The United States government has serious concerns about your recent policy decisions. The expulsion of French forces, the cancellation of mining contracts with Western companies, your growing relationships with Russia and China, these actions have consequences." "Consequences?" Traoré's voice remained calm, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "Tell me, Ambassador, what consequences did France face for stealing our gold for 60 years? What consequences did your corporations face for poisoning our rivers? What consequences did the World Bank face for keeping us dependent on aid while our resources made your countries rich?" The room fell silent except for the distant sound of traditional drums from a nearby celebration. One of Richardson's security men shifted uncomfortably, his hand moving instinctively toward his jacket. Traoré noticed the movement and smiled, not with warmth, but with the knowing smile of a hunter who has seen his prey reveal itself. "You know," Traoré continued, moving to his desk where a small wooden sculpture of a warrior sat next to modern state papers, "my great-grandfather fought the French when they first came to our lands. He was a Naba, a chief, and when the colonial administrators demanded he bow down and hand over our gold, our young men for forced labor, he gathered the elders under the sacred baobab tree in our village." His fingers traced the carved features of the warrior sculpture. "The French officer, a man much like you, convinced of his superiority, told my great-grandfather that resistance was futile, that France was mighty, modern, civilized, that we were just primitive Africans who should be grateful for European guidance." Richardson's jaw tightened. "Captain, I didn't come here for history lessons. History is never a lesson, Ambassador. History is a living thing like the roots of the baobab that grow deeper with each season." Traoré's voice gained strength, taking on the rhythmic patterns of oral tradition. "My great-grandfather looked at that French officer and said, 'You can take our gold, you can take our land, you can even take our bodies, but you will never take our spirit. We are not your subjects. We are not your slaves. And someday our children's children will stand where you stand now and remember that we never bowed down.'" The president moved to a map of Burkina Faso on the wall, his finger tracing the borders. "They killed him for those words. Hanged him from the same baobab tree where he held council. But before he died, he whispered a prayer to the ancestors. Let this soil remember. Let this earth rise up when the time comes. Let our people never forget who they are. Richardson stood abruptly. This is exactly the kind of rhetoric that concerns Washington. Your inflammatory speeches, your calls for Pan-African unity, your rejection of Western partnership. Partnership. Traoré's voice cracked like a whip. You call theft partnership? You call exploitation cooperation? You call neo-colonialism friendship? The African president's composure finally broke, and when he spoke again, his words rang with the power of griots who had sung resistance songs through centuries of oppression. For 60 years we sold you our cotton for pennies and bought back your textiles for dollars. For 60 years, we mined your uranium to power your cities while our people lived in darkness. For 60 years, you told us we were partners while you structured every deal to keep us dependent, keep us poor, keep us grateful for the crumbs from your table. He slammed his palm on the desk, and the wooden warrior seemed to tremble with ancestral fury. And now that we say, enough, now that we choose our own partners, make our own deals, control our own resources, now you come to me with threats? Richardson's voice dropped to a menacing whisper. Captain, you're playing a dangerous game. Burkina Faso is not Russia or China. You're a small, landlocked country dependent on international goodwill. Your military budget is a rounding error in the Pentagon's accounting. If you continue down this path. If I continue down this path, what? Traoré's voice rose, carrying the authority of ancestral kings and the righteous anger of the dispossessed. You'll sanction us? You already control our banks through your international system. You'll isolate us diplomatically? We've been isolated since independence, except when you needed our resources. You'll invade us? Then you'll prove to the world what we've always known, that your democracy, your human rights, your international law are just tools to keep Africa in chains. The president walked to the window again, his silhouette framed against the African sky. In the distance, a group of women in colorful pagnies walked in perfect formation, clay pots balanced on their heads, their movements a dance of strength and grace perfected over generations. Look at them, he said, his voice softening with love and pride. Those women carry water for their families every day. They walk miles under the blazing sun and they never complain. They are the backbone of our society, the keepers of our traditions, the mothers of our future. And you want me to sell them back into slavery for the comfort of your boardrooms? He turned back to Richardson, and the ambassador saw something in the young president's eyes that made him step backward, not fear but recognition. He was looking at a man who would rather die than submit. My grandmother, Traoré continued, his voice taking on the hypnotic rhythm of traditional praise songs, used to tell me stories of Yanenga, the warrior princess who rode her stallion into battle against enemies who thought African women were weak. She told me of Sundiata, who united the Mali Empire and made it the richest kingdom in the world when your ancestors were still living in mud huts. She told me of Samori Touré, who fought the French for 16 years and made them bleed for every inch of our soil. The drums outside grew louder, as if the entire city could sense the confrontation taking place in the presidential palace. And she told me, Traoré's voice rose like a battle cry, that the spirits of our ancestors walk among us still. That they speak through the wind in the baobab trees, through the patterns of the millet fields, through the voices of our children learning to read in their own languages for the first time in generations. Richardson tried to regain control of the conversation. Captain, let's be practical. Your idealism is admirable, but practical? Traoré laughed, and the sound was sharp as a spear point. You want to talk about practicality? Let me tell you what's practical. Our gold stays in our ground until we get fair prices. Our uranium powers our cities before it powers yours. Our cotton feeds our textile mills before your factories. Our young people learn computer programming and engineering instead of begging for visas to clean your toilets. He moved to another wall where photographs showed him with other African leaders. Young faces filled with determination, old faces marked by struggle, all united by a common dream. You see these faces? These are my brothers and sisters across this continent. In Mali, in Niger, in Chad, in Guinea. We're all asking the same question. Why should we be poor in lands so rich? Why should our children die of hunger while our resources feed the world? Why should we accept the chains you offer just because they're made of gold instead of iron? Richardson's composure finally cracked. Damn it, Traoré. You're going to destroy everything we've built here. Everything you've built? The president's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. You mean poverty? The dependence? The corruption? The systems that keep us eternally grateful for your generosity while you grow fat on our labor? He walked to his desk and picked up a photograph. A young soldier in combat fatigues, barely 20, standing beside a burned-out vehicle. This is Sergeant Ouedraogo. He died last month fighting terrorists in the Sahel. Terrorists armed with weapons that came from Libya after your intervention there. Terrorists funded by ransom money paid by European governments. Terrorists who recruit from villages where young men have no other choice because the economic system you built offers them nothing. Traoré's voice cracked with emotion. He was going to be married next month. His fiancée is pregnant with their first child. And you want me to continue the policies that made his sacrifice necessary? The room fell silent except for the sound of the president's heavy breathing and the distant call of a muezzin beginning the afternoon prayer. Richardson leaned forward, his voice cold and calculating. Captain, I'm going to be very clear. The United States has significant influence in international financial institutions. We can make life very difficult for countries that choose to oppose us. Your economy, your trade relationships, your access to global markets, all of this can disappear overnight. Something shifted in Traoré's demeanor. The last pretense of diplomatic courtesy evaporated like water on hot sand. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of every chain broken, every whip cast aside, every overseer defied throughout history. There it is, he said, his voice rising like a war chant. The mask finally comes off. The partnership, the cooperation, the friendship, all lies. What you're really saying is, be our slave or we'll starve you into submission. He stood tall, his bearing regal as any ancient African king. But let me tell you something, Ambassador. Let me tell you something that your intelligence briefings and your economic models and your military assessments cannot capture. The president's voice began to take on the rhythmic cadence of traditional praise poetry, each word building on the last like stones in an unbreakable wall. We are the children of civilizations that built pyramids when your ancestors painted themselves blue and lived in caves. We are the descendants of kingdoms that traded gold and salt across the Sahara when your people thought the earth was flat. We are the sons and daughters of slaves who survived the Middle Passage, who built your cities with their blood, who sang freedom songs in your cotton fields until the very stones cried out for justice. His voice rose, filling the room with power that seemed to make the walls themselves tremble. We are the people who survived colonialism, who threw off your chains despite your guns and your prisons and your lies. We are the generation that watched Patrice Lumumba die for daring to dream of a truly independent Congo, who saw Thomas Sankara murdered for showing that Africa could feed itself and educate its children and stand proud in the world. Richardson and his men seemed to shrink before the force of Traoré's words, as if they were facing not just one man but the accumulated spirit of centuries of resistance. And you, the president's voice became a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. You think you can intimidate us with your sanctions and your threats and your economic warfare? You think we'll bow down and accept your terms because the alternative is difficult? Traoré moved to the center of the room, and in that moment he seemed to embody every African leader who had ever stood against oppression. His voice took on the hypnotic rhythm of traditional drum ceremonies, each word a beat in an ancient song of defiance. Let me tell you what my great-grandfather's spirit whispered to me in a dream last night. He said, "Child of my blood, the time has come. The earth remembers every drop of sweat, every tear, every prayer whispered in the darkness. The baobab trees have been waiting, the ancestors have been watching, the very soil cries out for justice." The drums outside seemed to grow louder, as if the entire city was joining in an ancient ritual of resistance. He told me, Traoré continued, his voice now carrying the power of traditional griots who could make kings weep and warriors tremble, that freedom is not something given by masters to slaves. Freedom is not something granted by the powerful to the weak. Freedom is the birthright of every human being, written in the stars, carved in the mountains, flowing in the rivers that cannot be dammed. Richardson tried to interrupt, but Traoré's voice rose above him like thunder. And he told me that the price of freedom is never too high to pay. That poverty with dignity is richer than wealth with chains. That a people who stand together cannot be broken, cannot be bought, cannot be enslaved not by the sword, not by the dollar, not by the fear of consequences. The president's eyes blazed with ancestral fire as he continued. You want to know what we choose? We choose the path of our ancestors. We choose to stand tall even if we stand alone. We choose to control our own destiny even if that destiny is difficult. We choose to be poor and free rather than rich and enslaved. Traoré walked to his desk and pulled out a small pouch made of traditional Kent cloth. From it, he withdrew a handful of red earth, the sacred soil of Burkina Faso, the same earth that had drunk the blood of warriors and freedom fighters for generations. This earth, he said, letting the soil run through his fingers, is witness to an oath I took when I became president. Not an oath to you, not an oath to France, not an oath to any foreign power, but an oath to my people, to my ancestors, to the children yet unborn. His voice became a sacred chant, the words carrying the weight of traditional ceremonies. I swore by the spirits of Yanenga and Ouedraogo, by the blood of Samori and Sankara, by the tears of every mother who lost a child to poverty and disease and war. I swore that as long as there is breath in my body, as long as the baobab trees stand, as long as the Volta rivers flow, Burkina Faso will never again be anyone's colony, anyone's puppet, anyone's slave. The earth fell from his hands like a blessing, and where it touched the floor, it seemed to glow with ancient power. So bring your sanctions. His voice rose like a war cry that echoed through the corridors of power and reached into the streets where his people worked and struggled and dreamed. Bring your economic warfare. Bring your isolation and your threats and your attempts to make us beg for your mercy. He faced Richardson directly, and the ambassador saw in his eyes the unbreakable spirit that had sustained Africa through centuries of oppression. We have survived the slave ships and the colonial masters. We have survived the structural adjustment programs and the debt traps. We have survived your democracy that serves only your interests and your development aid that develops only your bank accounts. The president's voice began to take on a different quality, still powerful, but now filled with the hope and determination that had always been the secret weapon of the oppressed. And we will survive this too. Because we have something you can never understand, something your money cannot buy, something your weapons cannot destroy. We have the knowledge that we are right. We have the strength that comes from fighting for justice. We have the patience that comes from ancestors who waited 400 years for this moment. He gestured toward the window where the sounds of African life continued their eternal rhythm. Listen to that music, ambassador. Those are the sounds of people who have never been broken, who bend but do not break, who sing even in the storm. Those are the voices of children learning to read in languages their grandparents were forbidden to speak. Those are the voices of farmers who now own the land their fathers worked as servants. Those are the voices of young people who believe, finally believe, that Africa is not a continent to be pitied but a motherland to be proud of. The drums outside seemed to synchronize with his words, creating a rhythm that was both ancient and urgently modern. You see, Mr. Ambassador, you make one fundamental mistake. You think this is about me. You think if you pressure me, threaten me, perhaps even eliminate me, everything will go back to the way it was. But this is not about Ibrahim Traore. This is about an idea whose time has come. This is about a generation of Africans who refuse to be grateful for crumbs. Traore moved to the map of Africa on his wall, his hand tracing the borders of the continent with reverent precision. From Senegal to Somalia, from Egypt to South Africa, young Africans are asking the same questions we're asking here. Why should Chinese companies build our roads with Chinese workers when we have hands that can hold hammers? Why should European companies mine our cobalt for their electric cars when we can build our own batteries? Why should American companies extract our oil when we can refine it ourselves? His voice gained momentum, taking on the cadence of a continental anthem. In Dakar, they're learning to process their own peanuts. In Lagos, they're building their own refineries. In Nairobi, they're creating their own technology hubs. In Johannesburg, they're reclaiming their own minerals. And here in Ouagadougou, we're showing the world that a small country can choose its own path. Richardson's face had gone pale. This was not the conversation he had expected to have. This was not the pliable African leader his briefings had prepared him to manage. Captain, he said, his voice strained, you're talking about turning the entire continent against the West. That's economic suicide. Traore laughed, and the sound was like rain on parched earth, cleansing and life-giving. Economic suicide? Or economic birth? For the first time in 500 years, Africa is trading with itself. For the first time since colonialism, we're processing our own raw materials. For the first time in generations, our young people see a future on their own continent instead of drowning in the Mediterranean trying to reach Europe. He pulled out his phone and showed Richardson a photograph. A modern factory with African workers in clean uniforms, their faces bright with pride and purpose. This is our gold processing facility. Built by Burkinabe engineers, staffed by Burkinabe workers, producing jewelry and electronics for African markets. 3 years ago we exported raw gold or for pennies per ounce. Today we export finished products for dollars per piece. That's not suicide, Ambassador. That's resurrection. The president's expression grew grave as he pulled out another photograph. This one showing a young girl in a school uniform, her face bright with intelligence and determination. This is Aminata. She's 12 years old and she speaks 4 languages. She wants to be an engineer, maybe a president someday. Under the old system, your system, she would have ended up in a gold mine or married off at 14, or migrated to Europe to work as a domestic servant. His voice cracked with emotion as he continued. But today she goes to a school where the teachers are paid living wages. She learns mathematics and science in her own language. She studies African history that teaches her she comes from greatness, not from poverty and backwardness. She believes in herself because her country believes in her. Traore looked directly at Richardson, and his next words carried the weight of a father's love and a leader's responsibility. And you want me to sacrifice her future for your balance sheets? You want me to condemn her to the same cycle of dependence and exploitation that trapped her mother and grandmother? You want me to tell her that her dreams don't matter because some bureaucrat in Washington thinks Burkina Faso should remain a supplier of raw materials forever? The room fell silent except for the sound of children playing in the courtyard below, their laughter a testament to innocence not yet crushed by the weight of colonial economics. No, Traore said, his voice quiet but unshakable. I will not do that. I will not be the African leader who sold his people's future for temporary peace with the West. History will not remember me as the man who chose comfort over courage. Richardson stood up, his patience finally exhausted. Captain, I think you've made your position clear. But let me make mine equally clear. There are ways to deal with leaders who refuse to cooperate. Ask Lumumba. Ask Sankara. Ask Gaddafi. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a bushfire, acrid and dangerous. But instead of fear or anger, something like pity crossed Traoré's face. There it is again. The only argument you have left, violence. When your economics fail, when your diplomacy fails, when your bribes and threats fail, you always come back to the same solution. Kill the African leader who refuses to obey. He walked to a bookshelf and pulled out a worn copy of Thomas Sankara's speeches, its pages yellowed with age and frequent reading. Do you know what Sankara said before they killed him? He said, "You can kill a revolutionary but you can never kill the revolution." They murdered him in 1987, thinking that would end the dream of a self-reliant Burkina Faso. But look around you, Ambassador. The dream didn't die. It just went underground, waiting for the right moment to grow again. Traoré's voice began to rise, taking on the prophetic power of traditional seers. And that's what you don't understand about Africa. You think our leaders are the source of our strength, but you're wrong. Our strength comes from the people, from the villages, from the stories passed down through generations, from the songs that teach children to remember who they are. The president moved to the window one final time, watching the sun begin to set over Ouagadougou. The golden light caught the dust in the air, transforming it into something magical, something that spoke of ancient wisdom and eternal hope. "You can kill me tomorrow," he said, his voice carrying across the room like a benediction, "but you cannot kill the idea that Africa belongs to Africans. You can sanction us, isolate us, strangle our economy, but you cannot change the fact that we have resources you need and people who are no longer afraid." His words took on a rhythmic quality, like the flow of the great rivers that had sustained African civilizations for millennia. Every day more young Africans learn to code. Every day more African farmers adopt new techniques. Every day more African entrepreneurs start businesses. Every day more African students graduate from universities. And every day the questions get louder. Why are we poor? Why are we dependent? Why do we accept this? Richardson's security detail was getting restless, but their discomfort only seemed to energize the African president. "You see, you've made a fundamental error in your calculations. You've assumed that Africans want to be like you, that our highest aspiration is to be accepted by the West, to be considered civilized by your standards, to be granted a seat at your table." He turned from the window, and his face was illuminated by the setting sun, making him appear larger than life. "But we don't want your table anymore. We're building our own. We don't want your approval anymore. We're creating our own standards. We don't want to be the junior partners in your system anymore. We're designing our own system." Traoré opened his desk drawer and pulled out a traditional gris-gris, a leather pouch containing sacred objects and herbs blessed by the village elders. He held it reverently, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of ancient spiritual traditions. "This was my grandmother's. She carried it through the independence struggle, through the coups and counter-coups, through the famines and the wars. Inside are cowrie shells from the old trade routes, herbs from the sacred forests, and a piece of meteorite that fell from the sky the night I was born." He kissed the pouch gently, and his next words came out as a traditional invocation. By the spirits of my ancestors, by the power of the earth that holds their bones, by the wisdom of the baobab trees that remember when Africa was the center of the world, I swear to you, Ambassador, that Burkina Faso will chart its own course. The setting sun cast long shadows across the room, and in those shadows, it seemed as if the spirits of ancient African kings and queens were gathering, their presence palpable and powerful. We will trade with China if it serves our interests. We will partner with Russia if it advances our development. We will work with India, Brazil, Turkey, Iran, anyone who treats us as equals rather than subjects. His voice rose like a ceremonial chant. But we will never again accept the role of grateful servants, thankful for whatever crumbs fall from the master's table. We will never again pretend that exploitation is partnership or that neocolonialism is cooperation. The call to prayer echoed across the city as the muezzin's voice joined the rhythm of drums and the distant sound of people returning home from work. It was the music of African life, complex, layered, beautiful, and unbreakable. Traoré stood in the center of the room, and in that moment he seemed to embody not just the presidency of one small nation, but the hopes and dreams of an entire continent. So take your message back to Washington, he said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing a sentence. Tell them that the Africa of Patrice Lumumba is alive. Tell them that the Africa of Thomas Sankara is rising. Tell them that the Africa of Steve Biko is awakening. Each name he spoke seemed to resonate in the room like the tolling of a great bell, calling the people to remember their heroes and their history. Tell them that we remember every promise broken, every resource stolen, every leader murdered, every child who died because your policies condemned them to poverty in the midst of abundance. His voice began to build toward a crescendo, carrying the accumulated power of centuries of resistance. Tell them that we remember and we choose to forgive, but we will never forget. We choose to build rather than destroy, but we will not accept less than equality. We choose peace over war, but we will defend our sovereignty against any threat. The room seemed to vibrate with the force of his words, as if the very walls were absorbing the power of his declaration and preparing to echo it across the continent. And tell them this. Tell them that Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, son of farmers, child of Africa, servant of his people, looked the representatives of the most powerful nation on earth in the eye and said, "We will never be slaves again. Not to you, not to anyone, not ever." As Richardson and his men filed out of the room in stunned silence, Traoré remained at the window, watching the first stars appear in the African sky. In the distance, he could hear the sound of traditional drums beginning the evening ceremonies, their rhythm as old as the continent itself. His phone buzzed with messages from other African leaders who had heard rumors of the confrontation. From Mali, from Niger, from Guinea, from Chad, all asking the same question, "What did you tell them?" He smiled and began typing his response, his fingers moving with the confidence of a man who had found his purpose. "I told them the truth. I told them that Africa is no longer afraid. I told them that the children of slaves will never be slaves again." Outside, the night was coming alive with the sounds of celebration. Word of the confrontation was spreading through the streets like wildfire, carried by motorcycle taxi drivers and market women, by students and farmers, by everyone who had ever dreamed of an Africa that stood proud in the world. And in the presidential palace, as the drums grew louder and the stars grew brighter, Ibrahim Traoré sat down to write the speech that would be remembered for generations, the speech that would be taught in schools across Africa, the speech that would inspire a continental awakening, the speech that began with 4 simple words. "We will never be slaves." In the morning, those words would echo from Dakar to Nairobi, from Cairo to Cape Town. They would be sung in a dozen languages, shared on a million phones, written on walls and carried in hearts. They would become the anthem of a generation that refused to accept the limitations imposed by history, the battle cry of a continent ready to reclaim its destiny. But tonight, they were just the words of one man, standing in a room in Ouagadougou, watching the eternal African sky and knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges but also new possibilities, the first day of an Africa that would never bow down again. The ancestors smiled, and the baobab trees swayed in the evening breeze, carrying their approval across the vast African night. The revolution had begun, not with guns or violence, but with something far more powerful, the unbreakable spirit of a people who had finally remembered who they were. And in villages across Burkina Faso, grandmothers tucked their grandchildren into bed with new stories, stories of a president who looked the most powerful empire in the world in the eye and said, "We will never be slaves." The children slept and dreamed of an Africa where they could be anything they wanted to be, where their resources belonged to them, where their future was limited only by their imagination and their courage. And the drums played on through the African night, carrying the message from village to village, from heart to heart. We will never be slaves. We will never be slaves. We will never be slaves. The earth remembered, the ancestors rejoiced, and the future began.